there are television shows, and then there are cultural events disguised as television shows. Star Trek, which first aired on September 8, 1966, belongs firmly in the second category, though nobody knew it at the time. The ratings were underwhelming. The network was perpetually nervous. The budget was so tight that the production team had to invent solutions nobody had tried before, simply because they couldn't afford the obvious ones. And yet, from those constrained, chaotic, creatively desperate circumstances emerged one of the most enduring franchises in the history of entertainment. But the story behind the story, the weird, surprising, occasionally absurd reality of making Star Trek, is something most fans have never fully heard. Here are 20 facts about the original series that deserve far more attention than they get. The captain of the Enterprise almost wasn't James Kirk at all. When Gene Roddenberry first pitched Star Trek to NBC, he built the show around Jeffrey Hunter, a genuine Hollywood leading man who had played Jesus Christ in the 1961 epic King of Kings. Hunter filmed the original pilot as Captain Christopher Pike, a more introspective, philosophically burdened commander. Then he walked away from the project before the series went to air. The precise reasons remain disputed, but the result was clear. William Shatner stepped in, brought an entirely different energy to the role, and the character of Kirk, bold, instinctive, larger than life, was born. Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969 at just 42 years old, never witnessing what the show became. Spock very nearly looked nothing like the Spock we know. Roddenberry's early concept notes described the character with reddish, almost demonic-looking skin. The intention was to suggest something genuinely alien and unsettling. The idea was abandoned not for creative reasons, but for a deeply practical one. In 1966, the majority of American households still watched television in black and white. Red skin would have photographed as dark, almost black, an association the production absolutely could not afford to make. The solution was a subtle greenish-yellow tint combined with those now iconic pointed ears. When the show aired in color, the tint was barely noticeable to most viewers. The ears did all the work. The transporter, one of the most beloved inventions in science fiction history, was not the product of visionary imagination. It was a budget fix. The original plan called for the crew to travel to planets via shuttlecraft, complete with filmed descents and approaches. The cost of staging that repeatedly was simply beyond what the production could manage. Someone proposed a cheaper alternative, a visual effect suggesting instantaneous molecular transportation. The effect itself was achieved by filming glittering particles dropped in front of a dark background, then reversing the footage. It cost almost nothing. It became so culturally embedded that physicists today still reference it when discussing the theoretical possibility of quantum teleportation. Before the show even aired, NBC rejected the original pilot outright. The episode, titled The Cage, was submitted to the network in 1965 and met with a blunt verdict: too slow, too intellectual, not enough action. The network also objected to the inclusion of a female first officer, the character number 1, played by Majel Barrett. NBC commissioned a second pilot, an almost unheard-of decision at the time, and Roddenberry retooled the show significantly. Number 1 was cut. The action quotient went up, but Roddenberry found a way to salvage the original footage. He reworked it into a 2-part episode called The Menagerie, which went on to win the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. The rejected pilot became the only episode of the original series to win that prize. After the first season, Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura, decided to leave the show. Broadway was calling, and she had submitted her resignation. What changed her mind was a conversation that has since become one of the most remarkable anecdotes in television history. At an NAACP fundraiser, she was told that someone wanted to meet her. That someone was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King told her directly that Uhura was not just a character, she was a symbol. For the first time, young black children could see themselves represented on screen not as servants or sidekicks, but as officers, professionals, people of authority and dignity. Nichols withdrew her resignation. She later described that conversation as one of the most pivotal moments of her life. Leonard Nimoy was genuinely uncertain about whether he wanted to play Spock and whether the character would land with audiences at all. His primary concern was the physical transformation, the pointed ears, the altered complexion, and what it might signal to viewers. He worried that Spock would read as a monster rather than a hero, and that he would spend his career trapped inside a rubber and makeup costume. He also found the emotional demands of the role deeply counterintuitive. As a trained actor, suppressing all outward expression of feeling went against every instinct he had developed. What ultimately resolved his uncertainty was the audience response. Viewers didn't see a monster. They found depth beneath the stillness and warmth encoded in the logic. Nimoy later wrote 2 autobiographies. He titled the first one, I Am Not Spock. He titled the second, I Am Spock. The interracial kiss between Kirk and Uhura in the 1968 episode Plato's Stepchildren, widely cited as one of the first of its kind on American primetime television, nearly didn't happen the way it did. NBC, anticipating backlash from Southern affiliate stations, pushed for the scene to be rewritten so that the kiss was not freely chosen but physically compelled by telepathic alien characters. The idea was to give affiliates a way to dismiss its significance. Shatner and Nichols responded by repeatedly flubbing the takes in which they turned away from each other, ensuring the only usable footage was the take in which they faced each other fully. The scene aired. Nichols later recounted receiving a letter from a white, Southern man who said the moment had genuinely shaken loose something in him. One scene, on a science fiction show. Star Trek was nearly canceled twice before it finished its original run, and both times it was saved by something that had no real precedent in television history, organized fan campaigns. After the second season, NBC's cancellation signals grew loud enough that fan mobilized on a scale the network hadn't anticipated. Over 1 million letters and telegrams were estimated to have flooded NBC's offices across the 2 campaigns. Fans marched outside the network's headquarters. Petitions circulated on college campuses. All of this happened with no internet, no social media, and no digital coordination tools of any kind, purely through postal mail and sheer collective determination. NBC renewed the show for a 3rd season and made the announcement publicly at a fan convention, marking one of the earliest documented cases of audience pressure visibly reversing a network's cancellation decision. The 11-foot filming model of the USS Enterprise, one of the most recognized spacecraft in all of fiction, was never fully finished. The production team built and detailed only the surfaces that would be visible on camera. The top, the sides, the nacelles, the saucer section, carefully constructed and painted. The underside of the model was left largely bare, rough, and unpainted in several sections because the camera angles used throughout the series never pointed upward at the hull from below. There was no budget and no reason to complete surfaces the audience would never see. That original model is now housed in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. If you could flip it over, you would be looking at the unfinished underside of one of the most famous vehicles in storytelling history. Beam me up, Scotty, the phrase that has appeared on bumper stickers, greeting cards, and t-shirts for decades, the phrase that astronauts aboard the International Space Station quoted when James Doohan passed away in 2005, was never actually spoken in the original series. Not once. The closest approximations are variations like Scotty, beam me up, or beam us up, Scotty, scattered across different episodes. The precise combination of words that became the cultural touchstone simply doesn't exist in the source material. This is a well-documented phenomenon in popular culture. Played again, Sam was never said in Casablanca, and elementary, my dear Watson, doesn't appear in Arthur Conan Doyle's original Sherlock Holmes stories. But the Star Trek case is particularly striking because the misquote eclipsed every actual line from the show in terms of cultural reach. The alien civilizations that appeared week after week on the Enterprise's view screen were largely dressed in costumes pulled from Hollywood's existing studio warehouses. Major studios in the 1960s maintained vast archives of accumulated wardrobe from decades of film and television production. Star Trek's costume department raided these archives regularly. Roman togas became alien ceremonial dress. Western frontier Clothing became the attire of distant worlds. Props and suits from old science fiction B-movies received new paint and alien insignia. Attentive viewers occasionally spotted garments that had appeared in biblical epics or historical dramas, now adorning inhabitants of planets in other solar systems. It was creative resourcefulness at its most inventive, and on television, where the illusion only needs to hold for a few seconds at a time, it worked. The phaser, Starfleet's standard-issue sidearm and one of the most iconic prop weapons in science fiction history, began life as repurposed toy ray guns. The prop department's starting point was a collection of plastic novelty props already sitting in the studio inventory from previous productions. These were modified, repainted, detailed, fitted with additional components to look sufficiently futuristic. Under close inspection, and in certain lighting conditions, the plastic quality was visible, and the proportions weren't quite right for a serious weapon. On camera, with correct lighting and the addition of sound design, they looked convincing enough. The irony is substantial. Those repainted toys went on to conceptually influence real directed energy weapons research, with the U.S. military investing millions over the following decades in laser-based systems that trace their imaginative lineage directly back to what Starfleet officers were carrying on their hips. The Trouble with Tribbles, the beloved 1967 episode in which the Enterprise is overrun by small, rapidly reproducing purring creatures, was considerably less charming behind the scenes than it appeared on screen. The Tribble props were constructed from synthetic fur stretched over foam spheres, with small motors inside, some of them to produce a vibrating purr effect. Under the intense studio lighting standard in 1960s television production, the synthetic fur built up significant static electricity charges. Tribbles stuck to actors' costumes, clung to furniture, attached themselves to camera equipment, and delivered small shocks to crew members with increasing frequency the longer they were handled. The production team had to develop discharge procedures and manage how long the props were exposed to lights before filming. The episode required handling hundreds of them. The red shirt trope, the storytelling shorthand for a disposable supporting character who exists primarily to demonstrate danger before dying, was born directly from Star Trek's uniform color coding system. In the show's design, red uniforms indicated engineering and security personnel, the crew members most frequently assigned to hazardous away missions. Statistical analyses compiled by fans over the years consistently show that redshirt minor characters died at a disproportionate rate compared to characters in other uniform colors. The show never acknowledged this pattern directly. It accumulated through repetition, episode by episode, absorbed by audiences at an almost subconscious level until it hardened into a piece of cultural vocabulary that has since been applied in discussions of narrative structure, corporate risk culture, military analysis, and academic papers on storytelling conventions. The Klingon, now so synonymous with the franchise that most people assume they were the central antagonists from the beginning, were actually secondary villains in the original series. The Romulans appeared first, in the episode Balance of Terror, still considered one of the finest hours of the entire run, and were initially positioned as the primary threat. They were secretive, calculating, and deliberately coded as a Cold War allegory. The Klingon, introduced later, were more straightforwardly aggressive, analogous to a different strain of Cold War-era anxiety. It was the subsequent films, particularly Star Trek III, The Search for Spock,